Okay, okay.
Shall I turn it off? I'll turn it off.
Is it off? Now it's
No,
off.
it's
No, it's on.
No, it's on.
Okay.
Sorry. We're going to speed. Sorry. No,
I
it's
would
on.
guess so. Okay, colleagues and friends, I guess you found your places. I'm happy to have all of you here in nice, sunny Stockholm. We are really grateful to our Swedish colleagues, all of you guys, to arrange such a lovely weather. Incredible. Thanks for that. So let's just start with the language regime. We are having German on channel 1, French on channel 2, English on channel 3, Swedish on channel 4, and you can still speak but not listen to Spanish and Polish. So I hope you have found your channels. And let me start this extraordinary Group 2 meeting in connection with the Swedish presidency by welcoming warmly all of you here in Stockholm, not just the Group 2 members of the ESC, but also a few of our former members. Same warm welcome to you. Some guests from our Swedish organizations. I know that we are having a CCMI. We are not having Polish active. It doesn't work at all. No. So then we need to do something with the interpretation. I'm afraid we won't make it just in English, although we all can try. So I'm going to be speaking, and please give me an indication in a moment when the interpretation is going to work. Are you having something? No? Nothing?
I'm going to only noise.
Only noise. So that's the message to the booth. I'm afraid I'm really poor in Swedish, so it won't work.
No.
That's great. Is it working now? No? Nothing coming up?
Yes, yes,
Is it?
it's working.
It is working, so could I get the German, the indication that the German is working? Perfect. French is working. English is working. As I speak English, is Swedish working? Could someone check for the Swedish language? Okay. So, welcome all of you here. It's my honor to welcome our first speaker, Jan Olsson, here. Thanks for coming. And we are really curious to hear from you about, until now, the achievements of the Swedish presidency and also your plans for the rest, which is something like 1.5 months. But then the days are really long and the time runs really quickly. But happy to have you here. Definitely you're going to be our first speaker. You have seen from the program that we have organized our program into panel discussions, more or less. So Mr. Olsson to be the keynote speaker, more or less setting the scene. But then we are having the presidents of the 3 confederations here in Sweden. So I'm really happy to welcome Susanna Gideonsson, LO president. Susanna, welcome. Therese Svanström, TCO president, welcome, happy to have you here. And Göran Arius, SACO president, same pleasure for us. Then you have seen we are having a coffee break at 4 o'clock, and we enter into the second part of our today's agenda on discussing the Swedish model and its origin, moderated by some. And there we are having Irene Venemo, Director of General Swedish National Mediation Office, and interventions from Thomas Karlen, LO economist, Veronica Magnusson, President of Vision Trade Union, and Ursula Berge, Political Director from SACO. And then we are coming to the twin transition in Europe and the social dimension panel which is going to be moderated by Benny Johansson, and I'm really happy that our Swedish members have divided their roles like that, with the opening speech by Alan Larsson, former Director of General DG Employment, Social Affairs and Equal Opportunities in the Commission, where he was appointed by Jean-Claude Juncker as a special advisor for the European Pillar of Social Rights. So again, very interesting speaker and discussion then after, with interventions from Thérèse Covelin, first Vice President of LO, Peter Hellberg, first Vice President of TCO, and Jenny Ridstedt, International Secretary of SACO. And the last panel is going to focus on the need to fight for democracy and fundamental rights, moderated by Ellen Nygren. You know, we all know that in today's situation with the war in Russia and all the situation around the world, this is a very important discussion again, where we are having opening speech by Ms. Heike Rex, President of the Trade Union for Academics within Social Sciences, and interventions by Monica Arvidsson, Research Officer from LO, Charlotta Helge, Head of Policy Department of TCO. Hope to have nice discussions after, in frame of all the panel discussion to come from Sweden back home with more information, more knowledge, and much more understanding about our joint European current situation, but especially the future. I mean, the Swedish presidency is after the half of its operation and going to end at the end of next month. So therefore, we would like to discuss and hear from our guests about the achievements, but also about what is still to be done and what they see as the main challenges for the future. I mean, the presidency was already full when it started in January, with clear targets: Ukraine, continuing pressure on Russia, of course the climate and energy issues, which from my understanding are very high on the agenda here in the north, and also the EU competitiveness, pushing to one of the prior places of the European agenda. The war is really serious and brutal enough, but what was really unforeseen are the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, which the Swedish presidency had to deal with really urgently and manage in a very good way. It was also clear from the very beginning that the Swedish presidency is really concentrating on competitiveness of Europe as one of the focus points to address the long-term problems EU is facing for the moment, promoting economic growth. So therefore, the presidency also focused a lot on this. But if we put our focus on the economic output of Europe and consider this, that it is the issue that determines its strength, resilience, and global standing, we also have to keep in mind that the best aid for European industry is through investments and support of its workers. We are regretting a little bit, and I was quite surprised, that the social dimension of the current crisis and the challenges it poses in connection with the dramatic changes that we need to undergo really urgently is quite missing from the most of the current policy proposals. As workers' representatives, our main goal is to ensure that all the measures taken on the EU or national levels will maximize employment, income opportunities, and minimizing social and economic disruptions throughout the current transitions. But I'm sure this is something our first speakers are going to be focusing on. So I'm passing the floor to Berivan, and I'm looking forward to our discussions.
Thank you so much. So I will be...
Stort tack. Ja.
Tack så mycket, Lucy. Och varmt välkommen.
Thank you, Lucy, and welcome to my beautiful home city of Stockholm. Just like Lucy said, we have ordered brilliant weather for this conference, and it's fantastic to see so many of you here in this room in Stockholm. And I hope you will get some time to enjoy the beautiful weather and the city. But first, we have a very exciting program during the afternoon. I will be moderating this initial discussion. My name is Berivan Öngurur, and I am one of the 12 Swedish members of ESC. I am also a member at the workers group in the committee, therefore us from Sweden. Apart from my work with the ESC, which, as you know, takes a lot of time, I work as an international secretary at Vision Trade Union, the head office of which is located just a few steps from here. And you will hear more about my trade union later tonight when Veronica Magnusson, the president, will take part in a panel discussion. Enough about me, let's get started. During this discussion, just like Lucy mentioned, we'll be talking about the Swedish EU presidency and future challenges because Sweden assumed the presidency during very turbulent times, large challenges naturally with the horrible invasion of Ukraine, during social and economy recovery after the pandemic, which hasn't finished. We have the climate issues, we have the green and the digital transformation, the energy crisis. As you can hear, all of these challenges are big and major. And to help us, we have 4 eminent guests who have a lot of experiences and who will start this discussion. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, Mr. Jan Olsson, let me just briefly tell you about the structure of this discussion. I will pass the floor to Jan, who will make a presentation for 20 minutes about the Swedish presidency and the challenges and the achievements so far. After that, I will pass the floor to our presidents of the trade union, who will give their comments and give their views and opinions regarding the Swedish presidency and the challenges. After that, I will open the floor for discussion, and we'll be listening to questions from the audience. So having said that, I'm looking forward to a very exciting conversation, a lot of questions, a very nice discussion, and we're very happy to have Jan Olsson with us, who's the Deputy Director General for EU Affairs at the Prime Minister's office. You have been working with international questions for quite a while. You used to be the head of foreign issues of the Ministry of Enterprise, Energy and Communication. You were an ambassador and deputy permanent representative of Sweden to the EU, among many other things. So the list could be long, but warmly welcome, Jan Olsson. I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in front of you here today. Let me say a couple of things about the precondition for the Swedish presidency, a couple of words about the preparation, implementation, and maybe a glance at the future towards then. The previous presidency of Sweden in the EU took place in 2001, in the spring of 2001, and in the autumn of 2009. Both of these presidencies I spent in Brussels at the Swedish representative office. And as you know, this is a good place to be at during a presidency, because a presidency should be Brussels-based, or it should be based on negotiations which take place in the Council. This is what everything is about. The presidency follows the logic of negotiations. The member states in the Council should trust and should feel that the president assesses the path forward based on the negotiation in the meeting room. It shouldn't be the unnoticed the silent hand of the main city which should govern us. So the member states should be able to know, so it's not the Swedish order which is represented by the presidency, but the common position of the council. This is what we expect from other presidencies and what we want to deliver ourselves. The presidency, before this particular presidency, we had the late parliamentary election. The previous government decided to ensure a number of priorities in the parliament as a part of the preparatory work for the presidency. The idea was to have a common political ground in case the government would change, and it happened indeed. A new government came into place just 10 weeks before the presidency, and the areas which were agreed by the previous government, they mainly remains in place when Prime Minister Christensen, the new Prime Minister, declared the new priorities of Sweden. And let me repeat them again: Ukraine and security, green and energy transformation, competitiveness, the principles of legal state and democracy. So, as usual, the priorities of are what you want to do and you would like to add to the agenda. And the last applies specifically to the priority regarding competitiveness. So, a couple of words of the outcomes so far. When it comes to Ukraine, it was just as we expected. It has taken time and involvement, as much time as involvement as we believed it would take, and we've been moving forward. The necessary steps could have been taken. The 10th sanction package has been accepted. The 11th is forthcoming. Renewed decision regarding the customs, no customs for Spanish grain work with frozen assets, etc., etc. It should be emphasized at this stage that it is demanding to keep the team together when the financial realities, when people come into play, when countries become tired of sanctions. But here the presidency plays a very important role to pressurize the council to get unity, and this happens in long repeated discussions. Then we have the expansion. The important steps are being taken, and we're about to manage the ambitions of Moldova and Ukraine. In parallel, a lot of conversations and trips and visits in the Western Balkan process, which has also accelerated as a result of the new agenda with expansion referring to Ukraine. When it comes to the security issues, we have the migration policy, which, as usual, takes a lot of space. It's about the external agenda, trying to agree with the transit countries, countries of origin, regarding measures to decrease pressure on Europe, and of course to get migrants who have no grounds for staying in Europe to get them to return to their home countries. It's also about the negotiations about the Asylum and Migration Pact, which continues day for day. The presidency keeps the pressure up, I can tell you that. And the assessment is that there is a willingness in the Council to advance. But as you know, the fundamental question is a question of solidarity. Who will have to do what to carry the joint responsibility? This issue is not easy to resolve. The more technical parts of this package or the pact could be apparently be resolved, but the Parliament wants to treat everything as a package. How far the Swedish presidency will progress with respect to that. We'll see, but there is full pressure in the negotiations. Then we have the green issues, the transformation. Here we're focusing on Fit for 55, the giant package which was presented by the Commission in order for the European Union to achieve at least 55% reduction of emissions by 2030 to become climately neutral no later than 2050. As you know, this is an ambitious battery of measures from emission trade systems, new emissions for coal sinks, for forest charging, fuel, airplane fuel, ship fuel. A lot of things. A lot of people have been asking about how far this will get. But this has been a huge success for the three presidencies. We're part of them. First, the French managed to conclude all the negotiations on the part of the Council. So we were ready to start negotiations with the parliament. The Czech Republic took a very large step with the parliament and could conclude a large number acts regarding what we call LULUCF. And Sweden, these are carbon sinks, and Sweden has taken care of what remains in place, or including rather the third revision of the directive on renewable energy, Rev 3. Let me say a couple of things about how this happens. You probably know that, but this is more of a closer aspect of the legislative work in the EU, the so-called trilogue negotiations between the Council and the Parliament, when the Commission takes part to help and to find compromises. And this is an informal procedure, but in practice, this is something which is more or less part of all the decisions which are made as part of the ordinary legislation proceedings in the EU. The delegation of the Council is led by the responsible ambassador. These negotiations are informal. They are included on the agenda where there is space and time. And it's about, in practice, it's about long nights of negotiations, which finally decide in agreements. I'm thinking about, considering that we have the Swedish trade union leaders, this could be an efficient method to achieve results. Burning the midnight oil. This is an old, well-known method. Couple of words about our fourth priority, the democratic values and the rule of law. Sweden is one of the member states which have been very highly profiled when it comes to the all the processes in the EU which have to do with the rule of law. And this is based on our conviction that you cannot compromise with the fundamental values. And apparently, because of this has principal political reasons, but also legal and economic ones. The EU is a type of cooperation which goes extremely deeply compared to other types of cooperations between independent countries. And if a Swedish authority has to enforce a European arrest warrant against a Swedish citizen, a condition for this is that you can trust that the principles of rule of law will be maintained by the state which issued the warrant. In a similar way, whoever trusts a business operator who tries the free movement on the market has to know that they could be subjected to a fair legal process everywhere in the EU. And this also applies to all the workers who decides to use his or her right to work anywhere in the EU. Having said all of this, the specific work when it comes to these priorities for the presidency, this is slightly different compared to the areas which demand a lot of negotiations. Here, it's about efficiently managing the processes which are already ongoing. All the member states take part in the continuous review of the state, and it continues in the Council with our EU Minister Jessica Roswell when they have the so-called Article 7 process, which are currently ongoing with respect to Poland and Hungary, and hearings will take place at the end of May at the General Council. And finally, the Swedish EU Minister will lead a large conference at the end of June focusing on the rule of law and democracy. And now it's the priority which has to do with competitiveness, or as we qualify it, to improve the EU's long-term productivity and competitiveness. This priority should be considered in the light of the following. During a long time, we have been facing crisis, COVID, brutal attack of Russia against Ukraine, the energy crisis, and the inflation. This means that the focus has been on crisis management, support to citizens and businesses. There have been a lot of interference into the market, government support, the EU support, and the easement of the joint framework. In parallel, we have a development where, on the international level, we are observing a tense geopolitical situation where the countries more and more use their economic power to reach political goals. In general, the development has been moving away from the traditional open market with strong ideals of free trade, which we in Sweden have believed to be important to us, a small and export-dependent economy, and this has been one of the key, in our opinion, to the EU's financial economic strength. Considering this, the previous Swedish government and the current Swedish government have decided to emphasize the questions of competitiveness on the European agenda. The idea is to remind about the basic direction in which the economy has to move in order for the EU not to lose even more ground with respect to its competitors. The Swedish government is not blind in terms of the ongoing global development. It's about not losing track of the issues which have been of a lot of value to both Sweden and the EU. And this topic, this priority, was emphasized even further by the IRA legislation in the USA and the debates around that. Once again, there are intense debates about how far, to which extent the measures by the EU should focus on supporting and protecting the European companies. In any case, our Prime Minister managed to convince his colleagues that the European Council should ask the Commission to present a strategy to improve productivity and competitiveness. This proposal was made just prior to the Spring Summit in March. This was a good paper from the Commission, focusing on the inner market, trade, research, skill development. Additionally, an ambitious agenda for simplification and improvement of our joint set of rules in the EU. The leaders of the European Council reviewed the model, and we have received good feedback from the follow-up in the Council, which was very important for the continuous discussion regarding the balance in the EU's economic policy. This is something which is happening every day, every week, every month. Now it's discussed in the terms of the need of an economic security strategy. It's not a coincidence that Ursula von der Leyen presented ideas of economic security strategy. It was not a coincidence that she launched this in a speech which had to do with our relationship with China. So these are some elements of the presidency. We believe that it's going well. It means that it's going well in the processes which the presidency is responsible for, or which takes part. It takes part in Brussels. Our negotiation, our ways of dealing with negotiation is met with respect and trust by the member states and the institutions. There has been some criticism, domestic criticism, that the presidency is not noticeable here in Sweden, which is unfortunate, of course, especially for people who are political decision makers. However, it's a sign of the development in Sweden and a lot of other countries when it comes to the presidency, how it's managed in the public space with the relationship between the parliament and the government. When Sweden in 2001 became the president for the first time, we were still new members, and there was a broad majority in the Swedish parliament to make sure, to make sure that to keep it all together, and the Prime Minister could note that he wasn't challenged in a single time during the PMQs during the presidency. The second time round in 2009, it wasn't as apparent. No peace deal could be struck between the government and the opposition. This was not an issue in terms of the parliamentary situation because the government had quite a significant majority in the parliament. Today, we have a minority government which has a majority in the parliament with a supportive party, but it's not clear where this majority applies to all the issues, which is reflected in the Swedish debate. This situation in Sweden is not too dissimilar to what we see in the other member states. They're big, more or less EU-skeptical blocs, although no strong forces are present in the member states which deal with the issue of exit because Brexit has scared them off. But the joint political position seems to decrease, while 80% of the citizens believe that Sweden should be part of the EU. This is one of the perspectives with respect to the future issues, and I would like to say a couple of words about that. Another reflection is the future conference. It was, as you remember, about the citizens' dialogue, the discussion, the specific proposals which it resulted in have been managed by the institutions, by the Commission, which integrated in its new proposals. Some of them were already there. This was a part of ongoing negotiations between the Council and the Parliament. In the Council, we have been discussing the decision-making questions, probably a possibility to use passages in the treaty to go from uniform decision to a decision with a qualified majority. This was discussed to a certain extent. However, the discussions show that the majority support unanimity in certain aspects, and there's a question about whether steps should be taken from unanimity to qualified majority. Another future issue which I've mentioned is the upcoming possible expansion. Our opinion, and it's well spread among the member states, is that it's not self-evident whether it would need a change to the treaty. The Parliament, as you know, the position of Parliament is different. However, the process of changing the treaty would be difficult and would probably take a lot of time and effort in terms of negotiations. At the same time, it's completely clear that a possible large expansion gives an opportunity for us to discuss how the EU has to adjust its policy in different areas, difficult issues in terms of how to manage the EU budget. There are a number of reasons to discuss the future and for such a discussion, to continue such a discussion between the member states and the institutions. And for the discussion to be successful, we need to have good internal debates in all our member states, including my own. The interests and the interest organizations which are represented by you here, they play an extremely important role in this work. So please do. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Jan, for this. And I'm sure that we'll hear questions and reactions to your speech. But before I open the floor for questions, I am happy to welcome our three presidents of trade unions, Göran, Therese, and Susanna. So this is the collected Swedish trade union movement in front of you on the stage. And based on the images from the TCO Congress, you like to socialize with each other. You agree on a large number of issues. And therefore, all of you develop jointly the trade union priorities for the Swedish presidency for LO, TCO, and SACO. So it'd be interesting and exciting to hear about these, but also to hear your own reflections based on what was just said by Jan about the Swedish presidency, but also the future challenges. Warmly welcome all three of you. First, I would like to give the floor to Susanna Gideonsson, President of LO. Welcome.
Tackar och
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the possibility to take part. First and foremost, I would like to welcome you, Lucy. I am fully convinced that you, being as a new president for the Workers' Group OBC, will do a fantastic job. I would like to welcome the rest of you to Stockholm in a time when it's the most beautiful time of the year and almost the lightest part of the year for another month at least. So warmly welcome to Sweden. The topic for today is the Swedish model, and you'll hear more about that during the next panel when the Director General of the Swedish National Mediation Office will take place, Ms. Irene Wennemo. I would like to use this time to say a couple of words about the presidency and the challenges we are having together in the year from the perspective of the workers. The presidency is during the current mandate for the Parliament and the Commission, where the proposals are the revision of proposals being concluded. We understand that the Swedish government decided to be a good president during this time, and this is good that they act as an owner's broker. However, we should note that Spain, and this is the next president after Sweden, they have a much clearer agenda for some of the questions which we want to focus on, and they want to focus on. Having said that, from LO, we believe that the Swedish government could have been a bit tougher, a bit sharper during the presidency in terms of what they want to achieve. And but this is typical for us, for trade unions, to get a bit more and to reach a bit further. This is about the burning of midnight oil. This is probably correct. So from LO Sweden, we believe there are 5 important questions which we have to work with in the future. 1, the fundamental question is the question of democracy and fundamental rights. For us, the trade unions are a democratic movement. At the same time, trade union activities needs that the member states respect and guarantee all the fundamental rights, including the trade union rights. And these conditions have to be emphasized and they have to be maintained all over the union. Specifically, considering that there are strong political movements in Sweden, in the rest of the EU, which questions or even undermines democracy and fundamental rights. These movements, these parties have to be combated actively, and we have to do this while we should remind ourselves, yes, basically fundamentally the EU is a peace project, a project which rests on respect of human rights, and this has to be made clear in all the political forums. And we are seeing resistance from political forces who don't share our values when it comes to human rights. Even here in Sweden, we have a situation when a number of parties have created a government with the support of a xenophobic and racist party with its roots in neo-Nazism, and this creates problems. It creates problems for us in Sweden, but it creates problems all over Europe. Having said that, the Swedish model, which we have in Sweden, which is the basis for our work in trade union issues, this is the fundament that we agree with the employers, and so we try to make it better for everyone who is working in Sweden, everyone who is a citizen of the country. Another thing which is important, this is the question of the inner market with fair competition and work at fair terms. The inner market is a central part of the EU and has been that for a long time. And just like Jan mentioned, Swedish economy is extremely dependent on a well-functioning inner market. and a single market. And this is where the majority, the bulk of the Swedish market is exported. But the free movement has to be protected, which means that the fundamental human rights and trade union rights should not be some servant to the economic rights on the single market. And if there is a conflict, the human rights and the trade union rights should have precedence over the economic rights. But this also means that we in Sweden, all over the EU, we have responsibility to that all of this has to be done under fair conditions, and all types of social dumping and labor life criminality has been combated. You cannot just move between the countries in order to worsen conditions for the workers. The labor conditions should be primarily regulated through collective bargaining agreements, and it has to be improved through exchange of experiences by increasing the capacity. And we see that we in Sweden have reached far. We have a lot of good examples which we could present during the term of our presidency. We'll hear more about the Swedish model a bit later, but just a couple of words. It's based on the cooperation between the social parties, the trade unions and the employers, and a sense of trust that you met at the table, negotiating table, under the same conditions, finding solutions which work for the employees and for the employers. We can say that sometimes we also involve the politicians into that when we see, right, certain political issues have to be changed in order for us to continue our development. But mostly it's employees and the employers who manage to agree at a negotiating table, sometimes through burning the midnight oil. But finally, they agree, shake hands, and then we respect this, and then we stick to our agreements. This is what's unique for the Swedish model. And the Swedish model has been developing through, it's almost 100 years of cooperation between the parties, negotiations between the parties, and it has been very efficient in terms of creating safe employment, strengthening the economy, good work conditions, labor conditions. And this model is also unique when it comes to managing changes to reposition the economy when we had to, and to be able to do that based on the central level, discussing the major issues, but also reposition at the local place of work, where the trade unions, the local trade unions and the local employers, they meet and negotiate the best solutions. What it means to us that we get a more balanced, a more sustainable labor market, and we could say that the Swedish model is good to the benefit of regular people in a particular way. The Swedish model, maybe a lot of people have a straight opinion when it comes to the development. We say that we should never defend the specific workplace, but we should always protect and defend the possibilities of an individual in terms of its rights and development. So if a company is about to go bankrupt because they're not competitive, because their business model doesn't work, then we believe that maybe they should go bankrupt, but the workers should be protected all the way. There should be given a possibility to transition in security to find a new job, because we knew that the new jobs are better both to your mind and to your soul. And we know that the old jobs are the ones which wear out individuals too much. And given the trade union movement a strong role in the decision-making process, this gives the Swedish labor market model and the employees a possibility to influence the decisions which affect the daily life of ordinary citizens. And we believe that this is a fantastic model. But having said that, we obviously respect the labor market models of the other countries. We demand respect for the Swedish model, that we together in the EU shouldn't do things which would destroy systems which work properly. We should fight together to raise, we should raise the floor rather than lower the ceiling. And therefore, we have to create institutions together all over Europe in the EU to become stronger as trade unions, providing better conditions for the workers. Number three, it's important for us that the EU acts as a global actor in terms of improving labor conditions. The EU is important in international context. The EU signs trade agreements, other agreements with other regions globally. And there, as part of the EU, we could do so much more, which means that we demand that the EU should take clearer responsibility and clear the sustainability clauses in the trade agreements, human rights, good labor conditions, and respect for the environment. That the regions and the countries who want to who signed the agreement with us, that they should start work in this direction instead of just paying lip service. And we can do so much more to improve the labor conditions for the employees, creating a fairer and more sustainable economy globally. Number four, it's gender equality and equity. Equal dignity of all the people is important. The right not to be discriminated again and against, and the equality between men and women is a part of the treaty, and this should be implemented in all the areas where the EU is active. And all the parties have to emphasize these perspectives in all the forums where we have a voice. And this applies to equality, where active work contributes to skill supply and to economic growth. And we see this in after the pandemic, the labor conditions in a lot of places have deteriorated, inequality has increased, and this means that we have to focus even more on equal societies. Economic equality is about providing everyone with the same possibilities and opportunities when it comes to opportunities. You have to minimize, to make the gap between the rich and the poor smaller and to create a sustainable structure. If there is more economic equality, then the risk of social conflicts decreases. We can see that an equal economy creates a sense of mistrust, frustration, specifically among the people who are fighting every day to make ends meet. In order to avoid that, we have all the time to fight for a more equal distribution of resources. But last but absolutely not least, fair transition to sustainability in terms of economy, environment, social life. We know that earlier during times of transitions, the people at the bottom of the ladder had to bear the brunt of the changes in the society. We can never accept that. In the EU and globally, we have to use best practices of fair transition in terms of economic, social, environmental, and climate equality. And this should include different stakeholders, different areas, production, the human capital of the workers, and the consumers' preferences. If we're successful in this area, it will mean that the Swedish and European production will be competitive. Competitiveness should be based on skills, on quality, and the fact that we do it based on fair labor conditions. It's about safety and security for regular people. Finally, strong social partners and working social dialogue are the key tools for the transition work, and therefore we have to improve the cooperation between the parties in the membership countries where it's needed. We, all of us, together propose, LUTCU and SACO, that a creation of a new EU fund for social dialogue, for developing of strong, independent, effective systems for social dialogue in the EU countries where it's needed, to create an ombudsman or ambassador for social dialogue, that a new indicator for the European planning should be added when it comes to what are the conditions for the relationship on the labor market in the different countries, and finally to create point of contact responsible for social dialogue at every DG within the EU Commission, which would work to liaison between the parties on the labour market and the Commission to make sure that the parties' opinions will be heard. And our starting point for all of this is that the working conditions should be primarily regulated through CBAs, and the conditions for that have to be improved. It's important, I have to repeat that, it's important to us in the LO that possible EU legislation should be shaped in such a manner that it works together with and it respects our labour market model. And together we'll make sure that all the workers in the EU will get better conditions. Thank you.
Tack så jättemycket, Susanna.
Thank you, Susanna, for your very clear message. Therese Swanström from TCO. Your Congress finished just a couple of days ago. And sorry, I'd like to say thank you because you've been re-elected the president of TCO. Well done. Congratulations. Welcome here. I'll pass you the floor, please. Thank you, Berivan, and thank you for the introduction, Jan.
Improve my English, so I will do this in English. This is a lesson for me. My name is Therese Swanström, and I'm the president of TCO, which is the white-collar confederation for employees in Sweden. We have 1.2 million members in all sectors in the Swedish labor market up until now. And the Swedish presidency, as Jan said, comes in political challenging and turbulent times, absolutely. And we as trade unions and social partners need to be involved in the ongoing political processes going on in Europe. For example, the second priority of the Swedish presidency is about competitiveness. And I would really like to say that there is nothing more competitive than well-functioning labor markets, where strong social partners can, via collective bargaining, reach agreements and on working conditions, wages, working time, and so on. So, but also a very important issue is the lifelong learning and skills development, which is so important for all our members, but also for our economies. And the dual transition that we are facing really needs more and better social dialogue for the moment. I think we need to talk also about this in a very concrete way. I think the effects on the ongoing transition on the labor market can be summarized as follows. Some jobs will be lost, as Susanna said, and some jobs will be created, but most jobs will change or transform. And the speed of change will differ between sectors, between countries, and not at least important, between different companies. But they will all have in common the real need for new skills. So lifelong learning is going to be crucial for all skills level. We are going to need it to avoid unemployment, as Susanna mentioned, among those with shorter educational background, when new jobs are replacing old jobs. But the transition will also impact mid and high qualified jobs, since these groups of workers will also need to update their skills in order to stay relevant on a new labor market. And in times of rapid change like this, well-functioning social dialogue is absolutely crucial. And I am glad that actors such as the European Commission and the OECD also note this in their strategies. And I am very convinced that involvement is key in times of change and in societies and labor markets. It's always important, but especially in times of great change, when people need to be involved and to participate in making important decisions about their future. That makes it easier to gain acceptance for change driven by, for example, automation or digitalization. Because if you want people to embrace change, you also have to provide them with security. And in Sweden, we try to think among trade unions and social partners that we need to protect workers, not jobs. And if you want to be more concrete in that way, what could and should be done in order to reach the European goals up until 2030 of at least 60% adults in training every year? What do we need to do to reach that goal? When we ask our members in TCO, 4 out of 10 say that they want to reskill themselves at universities or other educational institutions. More than a third say that they are in need of reskilling, which they cannot receive from their employer. So we need to adapt to a completely new mindset, and we need to understand that education received at universities or vocational schools is no longer valid for the entire career. We need to accept that employees also need to reskill themselves continuously during their careers. It's obvious that individuals are going to need to return to universities for several times over the course of their working life, and reskilling must be seen as something which happens regularly. This means also that we must demand much more flexible training systems where workers can participate in, for example, short and part-time and online courses. More and more workers will in the future have a higher education already when they join the labor market. And this means, for example, that universities must get involved and increase the flexibility of courses so that also university graduates can update their skills and change occupation later on in life. So, in other words, systems of education and reskillings throughout working life are perhaps more important than ever before. Shortage of skilled labor is an issue in almost every branch in Sweden and throughout Europe, and that's why it's even a more urgent issue with systems of education. And it puts the finger on the challenge. We need to improve our reskilling systems in Europe, and we need to ensure 3 things, I would say. That reskilling systems are accessible and flexible, that they offer relevant education, which is needed on the labor market, and that they are properly financed. And when it comes to lifelong learning and attaining the skills needed for the digital age, there are also shared responsibility. Employers have a responsibility. The state has a responsibility. And, of course, every individual has also a certain responsibility for their education. But more and better cooperation is needed in order to capture all these necessary perspectives. Digitalization and the green transition are not technical issues only. Social dialogue has a crucial role to play for sustainable, efficient implementation of new technologies. So this is something that needs to be highlighted even more in connection with the forthcoming recommendation on the social dialogue. Social partners should be given a clear role when it comes to designing transition systems. It is them, or I should say we, who are experts on the labor market. And that is also why we have to strive for better and more social dialogue, both on the EU level and on member state level. There is no silver bullet for everyone, but we have to really strive for these goals. And maybe we fairly can say that the wind of change is blowing a bit in our direction. In the United States, we have, at the moment, a president speaking warmly about trade unions and their importance for the entire society. And in EU, the EU Commission is issuing recommendations to member states for pushing for a stronger social dialogue. And both of these developments would have been unthinkable only for 5 years ago. But of course, words and papers are not enough, and we need to push for real positive developments and continue this work. Countries with a strong social partners also actually deliver better results, even in the economy. So OECD puts it in a good way, I would say. Strong labor relations are key to reducing inequality and meeting challenges of changing world of work. That's a good quote, I would say, and a good reminder in this work. And you have perhaps heard that about our newly concluded agreement or on skills development negotiated by the labor market organizations in Sweden, which aims at and upskilling employees during their career, and which also provides financing for necessary study leave. It is actually in Sweden named as the biggest labor market reform in 40 years, and it consists of 3 important parts. Increased employment protection for workers in atypical employments like part-time or fixed-term contracts. Increased employability for all workers through better opportunities for skill development, and more flexible rules for companies to retain the right skills in the event of redundancies and greater predictability in legal disputes and so on. That's an important and very large work having been being done by the social partners in Sweden, and I hope we can, and you can talk more about that maybe during these days, because it's a good example when the social dialogue works in a good way. And finally, a few words, Susanna mentioned it as well, a few words about equality, and especially gender equality, since women actually are not fully on board when we are talking about skills revolution. Women still perform bigger shares in unpaid domestic work, and therefore also lower labor market participation in all member states in the European Union. And this is actually the bottom line is that women today do not have the same possibility to develop their skills, and this has to be fixed. We are talking about getting them into the labor market, about making care. Then you have to take care about care strategies and realities, improving systems for child care and elderly care and so on. But unfortunately, these things are actually going in the wrong direction, and we even see a negative development for female labor market post the pandemic, and that's really a problem for the European labor market, because on a societal level, the EU Commission estimates that member states lose 360 billion euros every year because the employment gap between men and women exists. So it's an issue about, of course, about equality for individuals, but it's also a huge deficit for the labor market and for the European Union. So finally, there is no quick fixes to tackle these challenges that we have in our societies today. But I would like to remind us that we are important parts, and legislation is not the silver bullet that solve all these problems. Of course, we need common laws in Europe in order to guarantee fair rules for employees and workers, a fair international market, and safeguard healthy workplaces. But we cannot legislate neither on European level or national level on stronger trade unions, on legislation on equality between men and women or on legislation on transition. We need to actually remind ourselves that member states themselves needs also to take a much greater responsibility on the key to positive change that lays within their responsibility. Brussels can support a push for necessary positive developments, but given the division of competence in the EU, according to the treaty, it is the member states who must deliver better results, especially in the areas that I have mentioned. So, having said that, I firmly believe that we need more cooperation in Europe, and especially between trade unions and social partners, more and better social dialogue. So this very gathering on the workers' group is a living proof, I would say, on our vivid cooperation, which we are so much in need of, especially after this pandemic that we've been through. So I hope that the discussions during these days will help us to take steps forward, and that you maybe also have a few minutes to enjoy a spring in Stockholm. Thank you.
Tack så jättemycket.
Thank you, Therese Svanström, for your wise comments and thoughts. Very important, no doubt. We have 15 minutes left for Björn's presentation, but also for a Q&A. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Göran Arius, the president of SACO. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, thank you for the invitation. SACO is a confederation of trade unions for people on the labor market with an academic degree. We have 21 unions. We conduct joint trainings, and we have slightly less than 1 million members. And I'd like to welcome you to the office building where we're in, because this house is owned by the second biggest trade union, the Engineers of Sweden, which owns the building, and they're part of SACO. So we've heard a lot of wise comments from Jan, Susanna, and Therese. So I will try to be as brief as possible because we're running out of time, and we'll try not to repeat what has been said already. Let me start. I was born in 1959, which means that I'm a child of the Cold War. And when I look at you in the audience, I can see that there are a couple of people who can say the same about themselves. When the Berlin Wall collapsed and when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of us thought that everything will be fine now, and things were becoming better and better year after year. I think all of us felt that. Unfortunately, that trend, in quite a brutal manner, has been disrupted, and I'm thinking primarily of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, but I'm also thinking about the inflation we are fighting now, a cost of living crisis for a lot of workers in Europe. Inflation, well, some of us who are slightly older were maybe a bit more used to that, but a lot of young people have now been facing inflation, that borrowing money costs money. The high interest rents affects a lot of households negatively. We've been also through the COVID crisis, and as someone mentioned, that the effects of that, or the consequences of that, are still being observed by us. And then the next issue, which came in the shadow of what we've said, this is the big climate challenges which we are facing. We're also seeing a lot of threats against our democracies. Democracies mentioned by Jan, Susanna, and Therese, and myself. We have threats against the free press, the free academic environment, also within the EU. And now we are facing major challenges. They have to be addressed now, and they have to dealt with efficiently during the coming future. And I believe that a strong cooperation within the EU becomes more important than ever before. Historically speaking, the EU has always taken, when facing crisis, it has been taking serious steps. And someone has said that you should never lose a good crisis, but you should use the opportunities of a crisis. And I think this could give us an opportunity to get a stronger and better EU for the members and the member states. Right now, we can be quite certain that the war in Ukraine is what defines and shapes the strong cooperation within the EU. I'm quite convinced that Vladimir Putin was thinking that, no, the EU, we can never stick together if I do the things I do. But as we say in Sweden, this didn't happen. And just recently, the Commission proposed a package with measures to send ammunition to Ukraine, which they desperately need to continue to fight in this war. And we're very grateful for them for their struggle. I am fully convinced that we have to hurry up the climate transition, we have to improve security in the EU area, and we have to secure the energy supply. Common problems we're facing in the EU require joint resources. We believe that the cooperation in the EU has to be deepened and strengthened, and would like to see specific measures, for example, quicker work with joint lowest corporate tax for large companies in the EU. We want the financial political regulations that it should allow the countries to increase the public spending for investments in climate, energy, R&D, and education. The EU needs more funds of its own. These are common challenges, and they will require common solutions between the EU countries. Sweden has been a member of the Union for almost 30 years now. It should be noted that the Swedish people are one of the most EU-positive people in the EU. We're very happy about that, but we're also noticing now, unfortunately, that more and more EU-skeptical and EU-negative opinions in Sweden, and we've seen in the UK how quickly this scene can change. So therefore, it's important for the EU to deliver the results so that the common people in Sweden and other EU members, they could feel that this provides benefits to them. We might believe that the Swedish policy has been too restrained in terms of increased coordination, and we believe that we need an open and deepened cooperation in order to strengthen the competitiveness of the Union, which is absolutely necessary in order to handle the large challenges, but also in order to provide good labor conditions for everyone working in the EU. As we've heard from the previous speakers, this is closely connected to us being able to succeed with skill supply. We need good training system, educational systems on different levels, and also good conditions for transition in the middle of your life, as you've heard from previous speakers. But it's also important that the EU follows the fundamental democratic principles. And like I've said before, this is something we cannot take for granted in Europe. The anti-democratic powers have to be combated. We have to act forcefully, and the EU has to act forcefully when the democratic rights, human rights, freedom of press, academic freedom are threatened or jeopardized. And I would like to say that we, being trade union leaders, being leaders of nations, being leaders of companies, what is our most important task? Is to provide hope to all the people of Europe, because if you lose your belief in the future, if you don't believe that my children's life will be slightly better than mine, or at least as good as mine, then you start losing hope, and then we could be facing a downward spiral, which is very dangerous in light of what we've said before. So creating hope to our populations is the most important thing for us. Thank you. Thank you, Göran, for your strong, important, clear message. It's needed more than ever. And if you listen to the three of you, we could really identify certain important issues you raise. One, based to the motto of united in diversity, which is the motto of the EU. This is where we have to meet. What is the strength of diversity? I've heard something which should be repeated over and over again, that we can never compromise with the fundamental trade union rights, human rights, democratic principles, or the principles of the rule of law, which is extremely important. And last but not least, something we used to take for granted is that the EU is a peace project, and it becomes extremely clear now that the EU is there to secure the peace. And this is what we notice when we have a war in the neighboring country. I'd like to thank all the four of you for your speeches. There are 5 minutes left, so I hope you still remember your questions. So if you have any questions or please raise your hand. Then we have the first question there. Number 2, Ochinse, the Secretariat will help us with the questions. But we have a question here on row 2.
Thank you so much. I should sit. I will sit if you allow me. Thank you so much for your interventions, and thank you for receiving us in this in the sunny Stockholm. Powerful words, hope, same rights. Those are powerful words and are very important also for the future of Europe and for the future of our children. I have a daughter and a small boy is coming, and I'm quite keen in order to provide hope for them, in order to provide a secure future for them. But my questions are linked to your speeches, and the first one is I'm coming from Romania, and my question to you is, how do you see the role of the East of Europe in maintaining peace and in the reconstruction of the European social model? And the question should be, it is in line with the specificity of the economical model of the East of Europe. This is the first one. Then the second one, since youth has been mentioned, and it's quite important, at least for me, what are the achievements of the Swedish presidency concerning youth? And the third question, because we have discussed about common laws and things like that, and the role of the companies, and right now about the fact of the fact that the companies are quite keen, to discuss with the trade unions to help the workers. I read yesterday an article in the USA media, and it was a guideline in how the companies could improve the life of the workers. So it's quite unusual for that part of the world, if you allow me. I will give you a concrete example in order to understand the question. Electrolux, it's a Swedish company, and in Romania, in 2019, the workers have went on strike for 8 weeks. 8 weeks, only for an increase of hourly wage with an increase of 0.5 euro. So in a company in which the medium gross salary is around 800 euro. So it's a Swedish company. My concrete question to you is how the Swedish companies are embracing the Swedish model in other countries, because it's hugely important since we want to have the same approach all around Europe. Thank you so much, and thank you for your interventions.
Thank you so much. We one. Yeah.
1 minute for the Italians is very difficult. I know that we. So my question is for Mr. Olsson. Thanks a lot for your introduction. And we talk a lot about strategic autonomy. You raised also this issue, but we know that we are in a new geopolitical context, and therefore the choice of new supply chains doesn't depend anymore on costs. It depends on other considerations and other criteria. But somebody has to pay these costs. And we fear that these costs will be paid by workers, pensioners, those who are vulnerable groups, because we need investments, and we see cuts in social spending. And we also see a push towards new forms of protectionism, because in this new context, as you say, the magic word, competitiveness, everybody wants to be more competitive between the European countries. And what we lack is a solidaristic approach. I know unity in diversity, but unity in solidarity. I'm sorry, I think this is the priority. And if we look at investments and only those countries who have the fiscal capacity can invest, what is the solidaristic approach? So I would like to know your views after 5 months of leading the EU very fragmented positions among the member states on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cinzia. Not small questions, but we have short time, so I will let you answer some of the questions that Jan that came to about the Swedish presidency. If you could do it in 1 or 2 minutes, and then I will go over to you to answer the questions. I know there was a question about Electrolux, and okay, Jan.
Thank you very much. And I am not a politician, you know that. But again, I mean, I think your question is very fair. And I mean, what is competitiveness, and for whom is it? And I'd say that the traditional Swedish way of viewing it, and I think, I mean, it's important to stress that, I mean, the competitiveness priority is not something that is sort of invented by this Swedish government. The former Swedish social democratically led government had the same priority. So I mean, even as a Swedish civil servant, I would say that one should not understand this priority as being at the expense of the worker. I mean, the idea of a Swedish model in this sense would be that, I mean, good jobs for well-paid jobs is part of a competitive Europe. So, I mean, that's a simple answer, but that's the kind of answer I can give. And that's, I think, is kind of the political answer that you would get as well. Then on the youth issue, I mean, what did the Swedish presidency do for youth? Well, I would say that the Swedish presidency did emphasize this long-term competitiveness, productivity agenda in order for youth in Europe to have a job when they need a job. So that's what I would say. Thank you. Not being a politician.
Thank you so much, Jan. And Susanna?
Yep. Tänkte jag ska svara hur vi...
Okay. Let me tell us how we from the trade unions work with the Swedish companies which misbehave abroad. My background, I used to work in the commercial into the trade center sector, sorry, and I've been negotiating collective bargaining agreements in Europe and Sweden for IKEA, H&M, etc. Because what we can do on behalf of Sweden is to help the local trade unions, but to discuss this in the boardrooms, because we, being the workers' representatives, we are represented on the boards of the companies. We are working on all the fronts to make sure that Swedish companies in other countries, they should do everything properly, no matter whether they work, whether it's Europe, whether it's the US or Africa. They should do things properly and make sure that trade unions' rights and human rights are followed. So we are working, each and every Swedish trade union is working with that, and each and every confederation is working with that. And I hope that the unions which are responsible for Electrolux, who were involved in your case, if they've misbehaved, because and they made sure because we try to influence companies here domestically, but also through international trade union work. Thank you. Thank you, Susanna. Any concluding remarks, Göran? Let me just, you asked the question, if I understand you correctly, how the eastern part, or the Eastern Europe in the future become a more of a part of Europe, and what we think about that. It's difficult to give a simple answer, because Europe is a quite complicated parts of the globe. We've been in conflict with each other for hundreds of years, and during World War II and even after that. I think you have to respect the fact that we have different cultural starting points. We have different labor market models, but we are still held together by the sort of glue being the EU. So therefore, it's very important for us to assist each other, to help each other, and to create the best conditions for all the countries in the Union to feel that they are a part of the Union. This is not an answer of how, but this is an answer of how I consider this issue. Thank you, Göran. Therese, any concluding remarks on the same topic? So now I'm back to Swedish. The thing is, it's a positive aspect that Europe recently has been focusing on a more social Europe. This has not always been the case, and this is very good. The question is how to do that and how we achieve that, what kind of pressure, what kind of means, and how we can influence the countries all over Europe to achieve the social Europe. And we have to become more active, and we have to apply more pressure to create more action in terms of the European or from Europe on the European level, but also the membership countries take the necessary steps in terms of this work. And this is key, because not in all the countries of Europe you have the safety nets, which are important for the individuals and for the development of democratic values in Europe. Thank you, Therese. This will be the concluding remarks, because now we're out of time, and I'm sure you would kill for a cup of coffee. So I'd like to thank Jan, Susanna, Therese, and Göran for your presentations. Thank you.
Lucy, back to you.
Thank you very much. Definitely the break is coming. I just wanted to use the opportunity, having all the leaders of the three unions here, to thank them really warmly for helping us in arranging this meeting here, also for coming. Very interesting, very useful. I've got a long list of questions I'm looking forward to discuss with you at the future occasions, but definitely thank you so much for the insight into the main issues, and yeah, the break, and in 15 minutes we are back. Please take your seat so that we can start. We would like to give everyone the proper time slot so that we really hear all the information. Some to you.
Okej. Välkomna till session.
Welcome to session number 2. I will be speaking Swedish. I'm not very used to doing that, so please put on your headphones. Bervan introduced himself, and I'll do that as well. My name is Sam Hägglund, and I'm one of the 4 workers' representatives in the ESC. Before this job, if you can call it a job, I have been working for 15 years as a Secretary General for European Construction Wood Federation in Brussels, and prior to that I was the Nordic Secretary General. But we'll be discussing the Swedish model, and for that there's an advantage to have been working abroad, because when you come back to your native country you see things in a different light. A lot of things I'm noticing now which I didn't notice when I was living here. And it's very complicated to put this. It's very complicated to explain what's specific about the Swedish model, especially compared to the other national models which exist in Europe. And what we'll be talking about today is what it looks like, why it looks like the way it does, and also I think a couple of words about how this model was created. I have a very skilled set of presenters who will explain this to you, and the first one is Irene Vennemo, who is Director General for the Swedish National Mediation Office, a very central body in terms of the shaping of the Swedish model. Please introduce yourself, and you have also slides. Thank you. I will also be speaking Swedish. However, the slides will be in English, and they're about to... Here we go. Here we go. This is a timeline. Things will improve. I worked for a long time at LO, and also I have been an under-secretary at the previous Red-Green Coalition. And currently I am the Director General of the Mediation Office. I will tell you more about the office. But to explain the labour market model of Sweden, you have to start by it's based on decisions which have been appeared gradually during a long period of time. And, here we go. We'll start in 1898. This is when LO was created, which is the Swedish Trade Union Confederation. Before that, there were separate trade unions, but here they decided to unite under an umbrella of one single organization. 4 years later, SAF, this is the Swedish Employers Confederation, was created as an answer to the creation of LO. And the first compromise that was reached, this so-called December Compromise of 1906. And you could say, if there's anyone here from Denmark, you will recognize this. They had a September Compromise of 1899. So 7 years later, this came to Sweden. And this compromise, the decision was made that employers, they should be allowed to lead and distribute the work and freely employ and terminate the employment, but the trade unions were given the right to organize. And as a part of this compromise, they decided, just like in Denmark, to create a mediation office which would mediate in the labor disputes between trade unions and employers. So this was the first involvement in the states in the relationship between the social parties in 1906. And it wasn't very obvious that the government would allow the social parties to do whatever they wanted to and would assist in mediation. This is something which is unique for the Nordic countries. In the rest of Europe, it's more focused, more in terms on regulation of what the trade unions were allowed to do. Here, they enjoyed a lot of freedom, but also helped to agree. They were not particularly successful, however, because Sweden had a lot of conflicts on the labor market. We were the worst at the bottom of the ranking. Norway was second. 1909, a bit better during World War I, but between the First and the Second World War, it was characterized by a lot of industrial disputes on the Swedish labor market. And they tried to do something about that. And a new legislation came in place in 1928. I had a lot of discussions about what to do with this level of conflict on the labor market. There was a liberal government supported by the conservatives decided to introduce a collective bargaining agreement, CBA Act. And they said that if a CBA was in place, then the trade union who has entered into the CBA, they had no rights to take to any disputes. Otherwise, it was up to the parties. But if you had a CBA in place, then there was a duty to keep peace. And to manage these situations, a labor tribunal was created. And the labor tribunal consisted of representatives of the state, the trade union, and employers, majority from the state. And they were managing disputes when strikes or industrial disputes were not allowed. And the trade unions, they didn't like this legislation at all. They believed that this was a way to suppress workers' rights. And then 1 or 2 years later, and the trade union found that that the labor tribunal was the best thing since sliced bread, and we still believe that, because this was quite an efficient way of making the trade unions follow the rules of the CBAs. And even today, the trade unions win about 2/3 of the cases in the labor tribunal. The next important step, which some of you have heard about, this is so-called Saltsjöbaden agreement. This is creates a sort of sense of pride in the Swedish population. This was the big major agreement between the trade unions and the employers. And if you look at the agreement, it's called the Saltsjöbaden agreement because it was signed in Saltsjöbaden, in place just outside of Stockholm. But this was the beginning of a new era. One thing which was important was that after the agreement, all the employers' organizations started to enter into CBAs. It doesn't necessarily happen in the other countries, but here, if you're a member of the employers' federation, then you enter into CBAs. And secondly, the trade unions and the employers decided that they will relate the labor market relationships, everything which has to do with salary, everything which has to do with labor law. This is a question for the social parties on the labor market. The state should deal with taxes and welfare, etc. So there was a distribution of responsibilities after this agreement was entered into in 1938. Not even this time the trade unions were particularly enthused. The LO was very divided. Several trade unions didn't like the Saltsjöbaden agreement, said no. And unless the war would have started 1 year later, there was a risk that LO could have fragmented due to the conflicts because LO entered into the agreement. But there was a war, and after the war, everyone believed that they could live with the Saltsjöbaden agreement. Regarding this issue of wars, this takes us to a big challenge to the Swedish model. The big challenge to the Swedish model was that we had an extremely high inflation. World War I, inflation increased rapidly, and you can see that the price increased by almost 50%. and the state decided not to interfere. The prices were whatever they were. There was almost a revolution in Sweden. There was indeed a revolution in several other European countries. Second time, rapid price increases, World War II, another war which kick-started the inflation. Now they've learned the lessons of World War I. They decided that we have to ration food, so the market economy was more or less discontinued during this time, and there was rationing of almost everything. Number three, the three inflational impulse, which has been forgotten, that's the Korean War, 1951. The prices increased from 1.5% to 17% in a year. And this was this major war. The US had to buy a lot of equipment, and the Social Democrats were in power. They wanted to allow the parties manage that. They didn't want to come back to the war economy. They wanted to discontinue rationing of goods. The solution to that was that they introduced coordinated negotiations so that not all the trade unions would try to follow the inflation, but they should do that together. And the employers were the driving force behind that. They wanted this. They contacted the LO, and they said that they wanted to have coordinated negotiations. So initially, the trade unions, or rather LO, didn't want it. After another round, they started with coordinated negotiations. So first, LO and SAF would discuss how much their salary should be raised by in an economy. After that, there'll be the separate trade unions would negotiate, and after that, you would negotiate locally. And this was a well-working model. The 50s, the 60s, the inflation was higher than in the past 25 years, but good real wage increases, reasonable development of prices. So there were not too many disputes on the labor market. This takes us to the 70s. And here we have a combination of different unfortunate circumstances. One, the Social Democrats in their election manifesto said that they would change a number of labor market laws, and this was something which was earlier managed by the trade unions and the employers separately. And all of them were supposed to be changed to the advantage of the trade union, and the employers believed that this was failing the model. The model was working well. LO thought that as well, but the politicians wanted to introduce these laws. When we have the oil crisis in 73 and 79, the inflation increased rapidly. And this model, the model which has been working very well very earlier, stopped working because by this time the public sector has grown. They were not a part of a model, and we had the white-collar trade unions which were not involved in the model. And they were negotiating separately. And the first agreements entered after the oil crisis shock were at a reasonable level, but later the public sector, the white-collar workers, started doing whatever they wanted to do, and the LO trade unions obviously started to follow. So we had a situation where the wages followed the inflation. Additionally, we didn't have any independent central bank, high expectation of the inflation. People believed that inflation would become high, and therefore everyone negotiated to increase their wages a lot. A lot of disputes on the labor market, and we had something called wage drift, that the wages in the CBAs were at a certain level in the industry, but then in the local negotiations they would increase. So those who were not affected by the wage drift wanted to receive guarantees in order to get the same development, wage development, as in the industrial sector. And this led to a spiral. The costs grew, the productivity decreased. The Swedish goods were very expensive to export. The government devalued the Swedish crown. The Swedish goods became cheaper. But then the problem was that one imported the high inflation again. The trade unions wanted to have higher wages, and the entire coordination model collapsed in 1983. So from 1993 and on, we didn't have a model to manage the situation, but you could say it was 20 very bad years for Swedish wage development. Real wage growth was negative, although the nominal wages increased a lot. The politicians tried to manage this in order to end up in a different situation. They invited all the social parties to a manor house outside of Stockholm, and they said, if you promise to have moderate wage increases, then you will get different offers, better pensions and other things. And the trade unions promised that. Everyone went home, and they continued behaving in the same manner as before, because they believed that everyone else would behave in the same manner as before. Finally, 89, they decided, the Social Democratic government decided to introduce a stop package, dispute stop, price stop, and wage stop. And since they managed to get LO on board, but just several hours after LO said yes, until all the trade unions, all the members in the LO became extremely agitated. The government had to resign. The government came back, and they tried to do something else, and invited some very senior people whose background was on the employer's side, on the trade union side, trying to get the parties to agree. And they did it for several years. And finally, there was a stabilization agreement in place at a lower level. But this was extremely turbulent times. And then also we have the deep recession of the 90s, which has been very traumatic for Sweden. And after a couple of back and forths, because during this time the employers, they wanted absolutely to decentralize wage formation. They wanted to negotiate on a company level. The LO wanted to go back to the glory days, then when they called all the shots, and the white-collar workers, they were not happy either. The outcome of this process was the so-called industrial agreement, which we're still living with. In this model, you have the industry negotiates first. First, they negotiate the wages. Once they are finished with their negotiations, then it's the other sectors start negotiating, and then you have the local ones. But it's not that the industry decides for the others. You have to find a different mechanism for that. They have introduced the system. Once the industry finished the negotiations, they tell their central organization, this is what goes. This year, the wages should increase by 4.1%, or next year by 3.3%, and all the central confederations make sure that the other are more or less follow this scheme. Initially, this was quite an unstable system. They were not fully sure whether this will work. Would LO accept this role? There was a lot of debate. A lot of people questioned whether this would work or not, and they decided we need another stakeholder in this system, and they took this small mediation group, which has existed since 28, and created a mediation office. And this new public agency's role was to support well-functioning wage increase. We were supposed to mediate in the disputes, which was the old job, and also we were responsible for statistics. And then some minor adjustments were made. Earlier, you had to notify about conflicts 7 days before. Now it's 7 working days before, so a bit more time for us to mediate. We appoint mediators. Earlier, this was a strange division about what the state did and what this agency did. But now we always appoint the mediators. The state doesn't get involved, or rather, the government doesn't get involved. We are the state, so we obviously get involved. And then they said we had a right to postpone an industrial dispute for 2 weeks. The trade unions or the industrial trade unions believed this was a good idea. The employers believed that this was a good idea, but a lot of other trade unions within the law were quite doubtful. White collars as well, initially. But this turned into a model which was working well. The public agency decided not to postpone the disputes to any large extent. They appointed mediators which were liked by the parties. But what you do is you mediate. So if you notify of a dispute, then you come to us. Our mediators will not propose that you will get much higher level than a so-called mark. So the mark is the norm for how much the wages will increase or might increase in this area. So you won't get much more than the mark or much lower than the mark. The public sector and the trade unions in the public sector, they have voluntarily acceded to this model. They said unilaterally we follow this so-called mark. This model, as opposed to the model which collapsed in the 70s, this covers the entire labor market. So everyone is affected by this model in one way or another. Looking at the wage increases, the green one, these are the negotiated wage increases in the industry. Swedish and Germany, we like to compare ourselves to Germany. And then you could see the different industries. The black is the average. And you see in Germany, there's quite a variation between the different industry sectors when it comes to wage increases. But in Sweden, you see that the industry sets the norm. There are deviations, but they are minor. For some of the sectors where there is a lack of personnel, or they believe that they have a lot of strength to have a dispute, they believe that they're limited by this. But in other sectors where the situation for the workers is bad, they believe that this model is very good. This model, we have. So about 88% of the Swedish workers are covered by collective bargaining agreements. So not everyone is covered by the collective bargaining agreements. In the private sector, so about 20% in the private sector are not covered by the CBAs. But if we look at the wage structure, we can see that there are very few people who have very low wages. So 0.9% are below 6% of national median wage. We're developing statistics in this area, but it's more common among white-collar workers not to have CBAs as opposed to blue-collar workers. So the degree of CBAs is very high for the blue-collar workers. And there has been criticism in Sweden that this maintains patterns or conserves patterns on the labor market, that women-dominated professions can never catch up with male-dominated professions. This has been said. But we can see that at the same time, we have a decreased salary gap between women and men. And one is work income and the other one is wage per hour. So before the pandemic, the gap was decreasing, the gender gap, and this has to do with the fact that women has, to a large extent, entered highly paid professions. So that's an interesting development in itself. There is a large degree of acceptance for this. We don't have this wage drift issue anymore. The negotiated salaries, which have been negotiated through the industry and then out to the other sectors, they are very close to the actual wage increases. Some differences are in place, but the difference isn't great. Although today the inflation is high, and there is a lack of labor in a lot of sectors. So we are quite far away from the situation we had in the 70s. And I think finally, you never know which slide is your last one. We have very few industrial disputes on the Swedish market, labor market. 70s, 80s, it was like 20s and 30s because we were at the bottom of the ranks. But we had quite a few conflicts on the labor market in the 70s and 80s. And after the industrial agreement, this has decreased to a very, very low level. We had zero. In 2020, we had 0 days for the first day ever. Not a single working day was lost in industrial disputes. Which means, it doesn't mean that everyone is happy and content. Obviously, there are people who are unhappy with the situation on the Swedish labor market, and it's expressed in different ways, which is not necessarily days of industrial disputes, but this is a huge competitive advantage for the country that the labor market is so peaceful. And this is not a Nordic pattern because Norway, Denmark, and Finland, they have quite a few disputes, but we have managed to find a system where we keep it at a very low level. Thank you. I will stop now.
Tack, Irene.
Thank you.
Väldigt intressant.
This was very, very interesting, especially the historical retrospective, and I'm sure that you have a number of questions, but we'll do it in the same manner as before. I have some questions as well. We'll do the questions afterwards. So let's do the presentations, and then we'll be having Q&A session at the end. The next speaker on the list is Thomas, who is economist in LO, and you will present us with LO's perspective.
Ja, tack så mycket.
Thank you. Thomas Karlén is my name. I'm an economist at LO. I've been there for a number of years. Earlier, I used to work for a trade union for white collars. I've been employed by trade unions, maybe not necessarily active. Thank you for inviting me here. Great to be here to discuss the Swedish model. It's quite fun. It's quite important. There's a lot to learn in terms of the negative outcomes, in terms of positive outcomes. Thank you, Irene, for a fantastic historical background in just below 30 minutes, because we have a long history. And Irene showed clearly that the Swedish model is old, but it's still very vital. It has changed, it has been developed, but this is one of the strengths of the model, because otherwise I don't think the model would have survived, if you can call it a single model. But it has been developing, has been changing, sometimes because the social parties, the trade unions have been strong with forcing things through. Sometimes it was changed after being threatened by the politicians that they will interfere with the wage setting or through other measures on the labor market because this hasn't been working properly. And these threats have been a driving force to us so that we could find our own solutions just a couple of years ago when it comes to labor law and transition. And we have done this before, as Irene has already told us. And this is a strength which has made this model a successful one. This is a model which couldn't be fully applied into a different country if anyone would be interested, because, as you understand, it's completely impossible. However, you could get inspired by a lot of things in this model and a lot of things to consider, even if you have a different model in your country. So for me, the Swedish model rests on a number of pillars, and together they hold this Swedish model. These pillars, they have to work together. If you get rid of one pillar, or if you make one of the pillars weaker, then the rest of the structure will collapse. Some of these pillars are about the welfare state, about the political focus on the legislation and regulation, but an important pillar is what we call the social parties model, which means that the social parties directly influence the model through CBAs and through the CBAs and negotiations. What's unique and maybe it's not publicly known, is that a lot is regulated in the CBAs rather than in legislation. When it comes to wage increases, everything is regulated in the CBAs. There are no statutory minimum wages in Sweden. And Denmark has the same model, but otherwise we're quite unique in terms of regulating all the wage increases and all the wages in the CBAs. And this comes to the other conditions. Obviously, there's legislation in place, but sometimes the legislation is dispositive, which means that we can agree on other solutions in a CBA than what the law says. So the CBAs have precedence over the law. A big advantage of this for us as social parties, and I can probably speak on behalf of the employers, is that we have a very efficient sector matching when it comes to wages. There's a lot of flexibilities, and different sectors can have different solutions in their respective CBAs. If you do it through the legislation, we normally say, then it becomes a blunt instrument. It will become a one-size-fits-all for all the sectors. If you have the advantage, if you can solve a lot of issues through the CBAs, we want to protect that, and we believe that it works pretty well. And this sector adjustment is a very important argument to continue to develop the model with the social parties. Iran showed that there were very few industrial disputes on the market, so which means we can arrive at a compromise because we have difference of opinion. Some people might say that this is a national tradition, but this has to do with the fact that two equally strong parties, the trade unions and the employers. And the trade unions can, and it happens sometimes that they can notify of a strike, but it's quite seldom we have to enforce that. We have a lot of resources, we can cause a lot of damage, and therefore we don't have to do that. We can just show our muscles, and that would resolve the issue. Almost, not always. A couple of things about the wage policy. The LO, for decades, since the 50s, have been driving a policy which was called a solidary wage policy, which we claim is a part of a Swedish model. And it's also called Rudolf Rehn-Meidner model, after two economists at the LO. So same wage for same work, no matter what the employer have. So if you're a carpenter, then you should have more or less the same wages, no matter which company you work for. Also, the wage increase paid is more or less similar between different sectors and different professions. And this was very clear at the slide where the Swedish situation was compared to Germany, where you see that the variation is very low in Sweden. Another important issue is that we don't believe that you should set wages based on the payment ability of the specific sectors or companies, because we don't want the low productive companies to stay alive or to stay above ground through the employees of this company having low wages. So we increase the wages maybe more than the companies can manage, and if they cannot become efficient and if they cannot increase their productivity, we make them more or less bankrupt. And this is a kind of pressure that it's very, but it requires certain elements. If several low productive companies go bankrupt, some of our members become unemployed, and then we have proper tools to help them quickly. It's about a general unemployment insurance, of course, and it's about very good opportunity of retraining, finding a new job at a high productive company or in a more competitive company, a company which can pay higher salaries, better work environment. We have been talking about the so-called active labor market policy, which is a tool. This is the involvement of the job centers to support people who've become unemployed, to help them to get new jobs. We're still doing that, but now we're talking more and more about regular lifelong learning and regular adult training. vocational training. We've been talking about the value of lifelong learning for years. It hasn't really been implemented properly, and obviously you never finish this kind of work. But I think we have made a lot of progress with the new main agreement, which was signed between the parties in Sweden, the central confederations this autumn, or it was signed before the summer, was implemented this autumn, which gives all the unemployed and employed people very good possibilities to retrain or to increase their skill set with a so-called transitional educational grant. And this is a very good example. This is evidence of the fact that the social parties can be responsible, can find solutions for major problems. And after that, the social parties went to the state, to the government, and we negotiated together with the government to implement this, for this to be implemented by the politicians. Obviously, a lot of responsibility rested on the parties. This shows that the Swedish model is still working really well. The entire main agreement appeared after threats from the politicians. They threatened to interfere into the rights of employment and other things. So after the threats, the social parties found a solution which the parties are mainly content with. So this salary policy, which follows the principle of solidarity, this contributes to the structural transformation. A lot of companies in Sweden are positive in terms of digitalization, globalization, structural transition, also green transition and climate transition. But what's required for that is to have good unemployment insurance, a good transition opportunities. But this level of acceptance is very important. It's a competitive advantage for Sweden that our workers are for these changes and not against. What is also the case is that a lot of people out there on the work floor, a lot of employees are involved in the development of the production of the companies, developing of the production methods, work with innovations, etc. At the company, not all the companies, but in lots of cases, together with the companies to develop this in a way which is obviously good for the workers, for the employees as well. And this is a big advantage if this possibility exists. Recently, the social parties have created a number of transitional organizations for their members. They are very appreciated, very efficient, work well. With the new main agreement, they are receiving new mandate to work with transition, vocational training, validation of training for people who are in the middle of their careers. So this is where the parties have taken a lot of responsibility for skill supply, skill development. There's always more to do. We haven't reached the goal yet, but we have done quite a lot, in my opinion. And to conclude, I will say how this model can survive, what's required for this model to work. And it's not very difficult things. Oh, it's difficult things to achieve, but it's not rocket science. What's required is a high degree of union organization, which means that we can sign good CBAs, we can take our responsibility, and we can also monitor the compliance on all the in all the place of work. The legislator or the agency cannot control the compliance as well as the trade unions, which could do it daily at each and every place of work. So what's required is, as I said, a high degree of CBAs. It's 88%, and you could always ask for more, but this level is very high, and it's very good that it's not decreasing. However, there is a threat to the Swedish model, because the trade union organizational rate is dropping, especially for the blue-collar workers, less on the white-collar workers, almost nothing. So in in 95, we had up to 88% trade union membership in Sweden, which was, I think, world record. But we have been losing this over the last couple of decades. It has been a problem for the trade unions, but also an extension for the Swedish model. So as long as there are a high degree of CBA, then it's not very urgent, but also this is something which concerns us a lot and is a threat to the Swedish model. There's also a repeated threat, which has happened earlier, about political interventions into the social party model when it comes to wages or labor. This could come from the Swedish parliament and Swedish government, but it can also come from the EU, as you probably have heard, and we sometimes emphasize labor market criminality has, it's not a new problem, but we have been emphasizing this a lot. We're working with this a lot, something which also threatens the model, because less serious companies, they can outcompete serious companies. And the welfare state, which is one of the most important pillars of the Swedish model, hasn't been really able to catch up. It has to be improved. It has to be developed. For example, in terms of, the unemployment insurance has been increasing a bit too slow, which makes us slightly concerned. There are also problems in terms of gender wage gap, and where there's also a wage gap between blue-collar workers and white-collar workers, and sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. So, to conclude and to wrap up, the Swedish model has been in existence for more than 100 years. It's been threatened, it has been adjusting, and there are current constant threats against the Swedish model, and so far we've managed to resolve these issues, and we have been able to find pretty good solutions, such as the Saltsjöbaden Agreement 1938, and hopefully the same applies to the new main agreement of 2022. But it's a struggle, it's a fight, and it never stops, because this is a model, societal model, is a model of the social parties. Okay, so I'll stop now, and hopefully there'll be more questions. Thank you.
Tack för detta.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm sure that there'll be more questions. I pass the floor to Veronica Magnusson, who is the president of Trade Union Vision. Tell us who you are and who your members are. I will do that. Hello. Great to see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of new faces, and I'm happy to welcome you to Stockholm and Sweden. And obviously, as you understand, we're very happy to see you here in May, when the weather is nice, when the trees are green. And those of you who have been to Sweden earlier, Stockholm in November and March, we probably understand why we're so happy to see you here today. So please take advantage of the nice weather. We don't know for how long it will stay. This is why we get so ecstatic when the weather, Swedish summer is the best day of the year, as the people say. My name is Veronica Magnusson, and I'm the president of Vision, which trade union. We have 207,000 members all over the country, in mainly municipalities and regional boards, but also in churches and publicly financed companies. So our members are found within energy companies, medicals. They could be medical secretaries, they could be case officers, social workers, economists, priests. A lot of people are members of our trade union, but everyone works in one way or another with welfare or with constructing and maintaining the Swedish society. My personal background, I used to working with social work, with refugee reception and financial support in one of the Swedish municipalities. I would like to thank Irene and Thomas for a very good presentation of the history of the development of the Swedish model and also where we are right now. One thing which your presentations made you think about one thing. When we trade union activists, we never know, when we sign something, we don't know whether the deal is good or not. Like you've said before, we have been against a couple of things, or there have been issues which have been difficult for us to accept when we have signed the agreements, and then after the fact we realize that these were great successes which remain in place. And I will discuss the Swedish model here and now for our members day to day. I will speak honestly, weaknesses and difficulties and strengths of the model. And first and foremost, I would like to talk about the importance of the European Trade Union cooperation, what you work with in your group, and how we could be united in diversity, how we could use each other's strengths to help our members all over the countries. And the strength of the Swedish model is that we resolve issues. Our task as a social party, as the responsibility of the employers, is to solve problems, challenges, and we start negotiations with the ambition to actually resolve the issue. We have the tradition, we have the dialogue, which was presented by Irene, and which has also been a cost, because it's not always easy to work in this manner. There are two quite usual misconceptions. One is that our assignment as a social party is to always to get what we want, what we, the trade unions, want. We can only succeed if we only get 100% of what we want. And the other misconception is that we are which we resist the employers in everything, and this is not the case. Our focus is to improve the situation for our members, and as social partners, we have to barter things with each other to succeed. It's about giving and taking in order to come to an agreement within the framework of the Swedish model. And this applies to the national level in the major agreements which have been described here, but also this is something which happens locally at the places of work with our local stewards, and they have a significant authority to agree with their employers at their place of work. And just like my colleagues mentioned earlier, I'd like to emphasize that the model has served us well, that it works properly during day-to-day life and during the crisis, and at the coffee machines at the place of work where you find our members, where you introduce changes which are important here and now. It could be that you get healthcare during your working hours, you get IT systems which actually work and make your life easier, that you decrease the level of stress so you don't get ill because of you just do your job, and a day-to-day life that you get a free basket of fruit or free coffee. But this model is also used in situation of crisis. We have recent examples during COVID-19. In the history of my training, we've never signed so many agreements during 1 year as we did during the COVID crisis. We can also manage major things such as Putin's aggression against Ukraine and make adjustments now when we're facing financial economic crisis. The fact that we can enter into agreements during crisis and that we can take responsibility so that our members can continue to go to their place of work and maintain the welfare, it's a necessary precondition. One of the most serious crises which we're facing now is the climate crisis, and we from the trade unions, we see that we should use our model to decrease the climate crisis. We should contribute to the climate transformation, climate adjustments. And here we believe that our model has already delivered with this transitional package and the main agreement which has been presented by my colleagues. We have introduced the system on the Swedish market, making it easier and make it more beneficial economically to study during the course of your working career, because obviously a lot of careers, a lot of professions will change or disappear due to the climate changes, and this possibility to continue to study might alleviate these concerns. But we also have to work to stop the climate catastrophe. We have also to work in the social dimension. We in the trade unions, we see the people, we see the members, we can get them aboard in a different. We can describe what makes you to take a step to change. And for that, what is required for that is to be secure in your employment. And this is something which we can contribute with as trade unions, something which can be done by the employers or by the politicians. But this is not only a song of praise to the Swedish model, but there are also challenges which we are facing. What Thomas mentioned already is one big challenge is the legitimacy connected to us achieving the fundamental core mission of the trade unions is to recruit and to retain members. And the decreasing number of members is a big challenge. It's a very serious signal that people, for different reasons, choose not to become members of a trade union. And here we have to stay relevant. Although we are very proud of our history, we cannot rest on our laurels and that young people would join organizations for historical reasons, as was the case in the past. We have to describe to the youth how we can resolve the problems which exist on the labor market today, which they're concerned of might appear in the future. A lot of trade unions in Sweden are investing in changing this trend, to increasing number of members, increasing of number elected officials in the different places of work. One of our goals is we want that about every 10th member of the trade union should also have a trade union assignment, and we should go from 9,600 elected officials to 16,000 in 5 years. And this is also an important dimension. We cannot be less organized than the Swedish employers, and Swedish employers are extremely well organized, and we have to respond in kind and to show that we're responsible for the model from our side. Another of the challenges with the Swedish model is the fact that it might seem to be a bit boring, that we solve a lot of issues through dialogue, through consensus, and therefore you don't get those disputes or these. It's not very clear to the members what the trade unions achieve, because a lot of issues are resolved through dialogue. And once we've signed the agreement, we have to follow the agreement. We have to follow the duty to keep peace. We have to maintain the CBA, which we just signed, even though we lose something as the result of the CBAs. But we're proud of our model, as I've said, but I want to be clear, our ambition is not to export it, not for anyone to copy that, because we organize in different ways, and this has to be protected. The motto of the EU, as mentioned earlier, united in diversity. And we have to find the diversity, which we find in the different models, in order to move forward. In TCO and in Vision, we are proud that Sweden has been a member of the EU for almost 30 years, and we can know that although there are some minor concerns, the support for the Swedish membership is at a record level. During European Days a couple of days ago, a survey showed that 68% of the Swedes support the Swedish membership. It's very stable, and this is very good to hear. So we have to resolve all those issues together. But if the development is moving in the wrong direction, we can be happy. We see that trade unions' rights are challenged in different quarters. We see that the level of equity and equality is decreasing in some places of Europe. There's racism. There's in a lot of workplaces, there's vulnerability when it comes to youth entering the labor market and the employment conditions at the beginning of your career. And there's also a huge lack of skill sets. Just in Sweden, we need to employ 500,000 people in our welfare sector, which we represent. And this requires that a lot of people would want to work on the labor market, can work on the labor market, and are trained sufficiently in order to work on the labor market. Also, in order to partly to use digitalization best way possible, but also to make the twin transition with the sustainable transition and the digital transition. And the public employees' conditions have to be improved. In Sweden, we have to learn from each other. And I'd like to emphasize that although it sounds like we in Sweden believe that we can solve a lot of issues through our model, we also need help from our other European colleagues and from the EU. And there is a number of initiatives on EU level which we welcome. We are happy for the initiative from the Commission to strengthen the social dialogue, because we believe that the capacity of the parties, of the social parties all over Europe, has to strengthen. A lot of positive issues happens in the work environment area when it comes to telework negotiations. We hope that the social parties can show that they can agree on the EU level. It's very important for us to learn from each other, but our Swedish model is based on the fact that the social parties are the ones who are best suited to resolve the task. We are experts when it comes to the Swedish labor market, and therefore we're very skeptical to hard legislation and political governance, because this would weaken our power, our strength as trade union. We'll try to find ways of changing and developing, and we should consider the general needs. And still, we believe in united in diversity, but we don't believe in one size fits all. So we'll hope that this diversity will continue to be a strength to develop our model and the European model. Thank you.
Tack för detta, Veronica.
Thank you, Veronica. I think you said a lot of very interesting things. It's not that we are against everything happening on the EU level, although it happens sometimes in the debates that the minimum wage directive, etc. But there are also initiatives from the EU which we support, and we have to remind everyone about this. And the opinion for the EU, public opinion, is more positive in Sweden compared to 2/3 of the member states. And I believe that not a lot of people know that. Having said that, we have the Ursula Berge from SSR, a trade union for... please tell us what you do. Thank you. Great to be here and to meet you, all of you. It's quite difficult to be lost on the panel after so many wise interventions, because a lot of things have been said already. Iran's presentation of the historical background of the model was spotless and complete, and Thomas's and Veronica's interventions supplemented the first speaker in order to understand how the Swedish model should be understood. My name is Ursula Berg, and I'm a political director at the Trade Union for Academics, SSR. SSR, this is one of the trade unions which is a member in SACO. We just only have people with academics, and what we mean by academics is people who have at least a university degree of 3 years, and this is specifically within the social sciences. Just to describe the Swedish social party model in brief, we agree with everything which has been said so far. So what TCO says, what Vision says, what ELU says, we support that as well, which shows that there is a wide unity in the Swedish trade union movement on the fundamental issues on how to improve the labor market. We had different members. I only represent people with university education. Thomas represents a different group. However, all of us are supporters of the Swedish model. So my starting point would be, well, I will continue. I will add to Veronica. So I don't want to go back to 1998. This has already been said. What I have been working with when it comes to the Swedish model, at least in the recent years, was this model is old, but It's extremely resilient in terms of creating conditions for change, and it could also face serious challenges. What was mentioned here before, if you look at the past 5 years and look at the Swedish, how the model has changed, there have been significant new elements. For example, the social parties have identified clear and large societal problems which are formulated in the different agreements, how the parties believe these problems could be, how the society could be improved. In connection with the refugee crisis in 2015-2016, from Syria, the parties signed an agreement on what is called here establishment employment. So the idea was to get people who recently arrived to Sweden, to get them an opportunity to get onto the labor market with a wage which should correspond to the CBAs. Other things the parties have tried to consider, like Thomas mentioned, this is the big program for lifelong learning, developing of skills during your entire work life. This hasn't been resolved by the model earlier, but thanks to the agreement which was signed last year, it creates necessary conditions for that. It is extremely important if you want to promote structural changes where it's about competitiveness. You cannot expect that you will work in the same profession with the same skill which you acquired when you were 20 or 25. A very important idea on how to develop the Swedish model using new elements during the pandemic and also during earlier crisis, so-called short-term employment. This was an idea of how to handle external shocks in different ways. Something which I warmly support is the idea that people who come from other countries with high levels of education, they should work in the field for which they have been educated, so that we do not people who migrate to Sweden shouldn't take jobs for which they're overqualified, because this is a waste of resources, waste of human capital. We should get better at that, and therefore, for several years, we signed something which is called Fast Track, which the parties were involved in, the social parties were involved in this work. So this is an example where we're trying to see what new challenges are we facing. Wage increases, development of work conditions, this is really important. We work with this all the time, but identifying new conditions for people trained abroad, for migrants, creating the conditions making easier for them to enter the Swedish labor market, a possibility to develop in the profession you have on the way to the next profession. These are important new challenges, apart from the huge challenge in terms of the climate transition, which might be the biggest biggest challenge we're facing, which and the Swedish model should support this transition. The new thing which has happened, which has been mentioned by Thomas, if the Swedish model earlier dealt mainly with with the CBAs, which were negotiated between the employers and the trade unions. But the new element since a couple of years is that you ask the state to deliver in terms of the big societal problems we want to solve. The latest reform, where we put demands to the state to pay with state resources to support a possibility to develop your skill sets, because this is something which is to the benefit of the state and the society in general. And this is a substantially new element that the Swedish model more and more often contains so-called tripartite agreements, where the employers and trade unions together go to the state pressuring the state, trying to get a positive societal development. And I believe that there are reasons to emphasize this. And that there should be a positive approach to a further development of the Swedish model. You find a completely new toolbox, the parties that is, to continue to improve the conditions on the Swedish labor market. Just as my colleagues mentioned, and what I believe is important to emphasize, there's still major challenges left. Equal pay. We have to work that there's the systemic discrimination of women. In Sweden, 2 of the 3 people in higher education are women. Women educate longer, better. They have been doing this compared to men, and they've been doing this for quite a lot of years, and there's still an unexplained wage salary discrimination of women. This is a structural problem, and we have to use the Swedish model to do something about that. Something which was mentioned by Veronica, which I would like to emphasize a lot, is the lack of skills in the welfare sector. Just as Veronica said, 500,000 people have to get into the welfare center in the upcoming decade, and the working conditions or the salaries are not very competitive in the welfare center. It seems like the society is built on a generous it's important that society is built on a generous and well-developed welfare state with the school, education, social services, etc. But we need people in this sector in order for us to have general welfare. So equal pay, general welfare, competitive wages. This is a very huge challenge to the Swedish model, which we have to work with, which we're working with, and also climate transition, as I mentioned before, climate transformation. And just in order to wrap up, because I believe that there are a lot of questions, let me say that on one hand, we're very united as the Swedish trade union movement. We're moving in the same direction. We are also seeing the same challenges in terms of the Swedish model. Our ambition for our trade unions to recruit new members and to grow. We were founded in 1958. We've been growing year by year. We get more and more members every year. The best member of the union is not a member of my trade union, but he's a member of one of Thomas's trade unions. Because you have to strengthen the weakest link. They're a part of we have in restaurants, so jobs, the people who train lately receive higher education, become members of us. But for the start, if you fry hamburgers at McDonald's, you need these people to become members of the trade unions. And in terms of the trade union solidarity, the next member of the union should be in your union. Thank you. Thank you. I agree.
Tack så hemskt mycket.
Thank you, Ursula. This was very valuable for you to remind us that there are a lot of flaws in the Swedish model, even though we're happy with a lot of its components and it works well. A lot of things should be done better. And there's one thing I would like to raise. If you come to Sweden from a different country, you don't get a job at the level of skills which you should get, and you get this at the level, and this is a waste of skill. If we don't have a labor market which works in that respect, that you can get a job at the level of corresponding to your level of skills just because you're born outside of Sweden, this means that something is wrong with the model, and I agree with what you said there. Okay, now it's the Q&A session. And being the moderator, you should have some advantages. So I will start by asking some questions, maybe to you, Irene. My questions are connected to the issue of stability. This is something you've mentioned, the stability of the Swedish society in different respects. You've mentioned the Saltsjöbaden agreement. This is where everything started. 1938, where they decided that the state should stay outside the wage negotiations. In the 30s, there was a recession, as you remember, a depression, and for the trade unions, the choice was between communism or fascism. And they wanted to do something else, and they called it the third way. And there was, at the time, there was a bestseller by an American journalist whose name was Marquis Childs, who wrote Sweden, the Middle Way. So between the American capitalism and the Soviet communism. And he motivated the New Deal with a reference to what was done in Sweden. So there's an interesting background. But my question is about the employers' side. Is there anything about the fact that the employers are a bit more stable or more organized in Sweden compared to a lot of other countries? I'm also thinking about the fact that in Sweden we have certain dynasties. We have a family which has been dominating the business sector and companies for 150 years, which I don't think that's the case in any of the other countries. Has that been of any importance to the sense of stability? My next question, which also has to do with stability, what you said, Veronica, about the culture of consensus, that there is in the Swedish society compared to a lot of other European countries, the starting point is that you should be able to agree on things. And a number of comparative studies in sociology have shown that Sweden is the country where you see consensus most of anyone else compared to, but for example, France is on the other side of the scale, where I know about this because I'm married to a French woman, so it's complicated. Could that have affected the stability? That there's some kind of culture, there's kind of societal culture which is based on consensus or culture of consensus. Thank you. Very interesting questions. You can say that the employers, an important factor was to be a member of an employers organization was the same thing as to have a CBA. You have different rules in different countries, and this has contributed to a very high degree of the CBAs. A lot of people want to be members of employers organization. They're very good at recruiting new members. The trade unions have the right to start that industrial disputes against unorganized employers. And this is the employers organization. They accept that because this makes these companies their new members. And then in the established sectors, this is all very easy. But we have the growing sectors which are organized by a certain employers organization. Then it's much more challenging to get them to accept CBAs. But there's interesting development. You try to create easier and CBAs which are easier to manage for these growing sectors which find this to be a bit too complicated. And our model was in trouble in the 70s and 80s, and the employers didn't believe that the model delivered what they believed to be important, and they were about to abandon the model completely. And only recently, they are sort of back at the table at full force. The new main agreement, which was mentioned by several people, this is a clear signal that the employers believe that it's important to come to an agreement with the trade union. And you can see that in different ways possible. If you can beat them, join them. It's a bit like that. Trade unions are still very strong in the country. Some of the sectors have a lower degree of organization, and therefore it's better to do things together with the trade unions. This is the This is the line on for the employees. And this is good. This strengthens this model because they believe it's good. And the recent round of negotiations, without any days of dispute, we managed to reach an agreement at a level which was found to be reasonable for the trade unions and for employers. And this indicated to the employers that this is a model which should be supported. And then when it comes to consensus, I think it's not the fact that it's oriented towards consensus, but I think we have a very rich life of associations. We organize a lot in different associations. We live normally. These are housing associations. We have a lot of Swedes are members of different associations. You know what it's like. We have to attend all those meetings and in the different associations. And quite often, the decisions are made in consensus. There are very few votes in these associations. You discuss and you make decisions. So I think we train and we get better at making decisions in this manner. I think it's a very important factor that we have a large number of associations in different walks of life. So the fact that we're organized when it comes to trade unions, this is a subset of us being voluntarily organized in a lot of other areas. Thank you. I have a list of people who want to ask some questions. So at the top of my list, Maria Nicolopoulou.
Sorry, I wanted the one to sing, you know. This is not good enough for me.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Maria from Spain. And I really thank you for your interventions. They were very interesting. And Veronica put together two words that I would very much like to hear together, happy workers. And I think that everyone realized your commitment to improving workers' condition and constantly. And I wanted to ask you a more concrete question related to working hours. If part of the actions that are on the union's agendas is to reduce the general working hours. And I'm asking this because recently I came across an article describing the pilot project that took place, if I'm not mistaken, if the article was accurate enough, some years ago in a university hospital. Apparently there was a pilot project from the government to reduce from 8 hours to 6 hours the working time from about 80 people, nurses and doctors, and then hire more people to cover the shifts. And apparently, from what I understood, the project was quite successful for the workers. Everybody was very happy, but the government said we could not continue or scale it up because it was too expensive. So just to see if it's accurate, what I've read, and if it's still on the agenda, or if it can be in the future agendas, the reduction of working hours. Thank you.
Tack så mycket.
Thank you. Speaking of happy workers, we said that we should have a happier Mondays, that you should feel slightly happier when you go to work on Mondays. But the working hours issue is huge on the Swedish labor market. We have, I think, in a lot of unions, a lot of members rather, want to decrease the working hours, and it's expressed in different ways. For white-collar workers, it could be the time during which you're at the disposal of your employer, that there's a lot of overtime, you have to decrease that. For a lot of blue-collar workers, it's about where you work, and you can affect and steer when you work. So in general, I think when you ask the members, they want to work shorter working hours. And just like you said, there have been a number of pilots, a number of attempts where they have decreased the working hours to 6, 7 a day, but there are no large-scale attempts. Were normally pilots. They were assessed. It was good, but it wasn't taken to the next level. And I think more of the trade unions and one of the major trade unions, we have decided our congresses that we should decrease the working hours, but for certain professions, you could decrease the total number of working hours during a week, but we can also decrease the number of hours in preparedness or more vacation days, etc. So the working hours issue is big, and it has become bigger recently because earlier wage was at the top priority, but now the working hours is equally important. And we have the question which you've mentioned before, which there's not enough skills in a lot of people, so the employers need all the hours which the people have to put in, and they're quite negative in terms of decreasing the working hours. Thank you.
Nästa som står på...
Next speaker is Franca. Where are you? Please.
Merci Zam. Oui, je suis la française, donc la France située à l'autre échelle.
Hi, I'm from France, so I'm the one on the other side of the scope you were mentioning earlier on. So I wanted to thank you very much. This was very interesting indeed. And I'm very happy to be here in Sweden, and I believe you must be very proud of your model, although you have acknowledged that it does have a few issues. You talked about the history, and every model is unique because of its history, because of its culture, because of its people. Now, of course, Europe has a long history, has many cultures and many peoples. I have a somewhat direct question. So you are very proud to have your model. It's a model that functions. And do you feel threatened by directive or legislation at European level? Also, social legislation, because as you know, many countries need a new European impetus to go forward, to be able to move forward, because they don't have your history and your model. They don't have your level of trust when it comes to negotiations as well. So are there any European legislative social initiatives you feel threatened by? Thank you very much.
Thomas? Volunteer? Well, I don't know if I volunteer to answer, but thank you for your question. Well, it's not a secret that we feel threatened by the proposal regarding statutory minimum wages coming from Brussels. I think it was made clear by all the speakers on stage that we are very happy and with the model we have, where the social parties are fully responsible for the wages in Sweden, and we don't want Swedish or other politicians to interfere with the setting of the wages. However, we understand that other countries, other trade unions in other countries believe that statutory minimum wages are a great idea and they need that. We would have proposed that unless we wouldn't have the history and the position we're in Sweden today. Naturally, it's the case if you cannot, for whatever reason, have a Swedish model with a high level of organization, CBA, and consensus, everything we've mentioned, then it's naturally the case that you need the help of the legislator to a much higher degree. So we feel threatened because if we would have a statutory minimum wage, it would be serious interference with our model of setting wages, which would decrease the flexibility of the sectors, as we've discussed. We believe that fewer people would become members of the LO because of the trade unions, because the wages will be set not by the trade unions employers but by the state. We also believe that the employers would not sign the CBAs to the same degree, because you could still be an honest employer and you could follow the law without following the CBAs. I understand that it sounds strange to you, might do in your context, but this is a very important position. But I'd like to emphasize that we support all the other solutions, whatever they might be, whatever the trade unions propose in the other countries. We have full understanding, we have full respect for you who believe that statutory minimum wages are good to raise the lowest wages in your countries and therefore improve the quality standard of life. Our core mission is to set the wages. This is why the trade unions were created in Sweden many years ago, and surely in a lot of other countries. We have been doing this for more than 100 years, and we believe that this is a model which works well. The way it looks like, it means that weak trade unions get help from strong trade unions to get higher wages than they would have gotten otherwise, while the strong trade unions maybe don't get as much as they would get if the market forces would be in place, but we coordinate our efforts, which means that we keep the lowest wages at a fairly high level in Sweden. As you've seen on the slide, there are quite few people who have low wages in Sweden, very few who have wages which are much lower than the wages set by our CBAs. So we believe that our ways works well here, and we're also supported by Denmark. They're in a similar position. I think you've heard these arguments from the Swedes now for all those years. But you shouldn't miss it. You should understand us correctly. It doesn't mean that we don't want you to have such minimum wages in your countries, but we believe that in a longer term, it could threaten the number of members and we in the trade unions, and it would result to lower minimum wages in Sweden compared to today. This is why we don't like this legislation. We haven't changed our mind that much, at least not when it comes to the principal issues. Then we're also pragmatic and obedient when it comes to a lot of issues. Thank you. Irene would like to say something. Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one, and this is a question which the system in Sweden deals with a lot. And I have been working with the different negotiations when it comes to different directives, when it comes to the... And for a long time, people felt that the Swedish model was ill-fitting because it's so debating together with Denmark. And this was something which was discussed during each round of negotiations. We had to explain what's so good about this model. But the problem is that even in the EU and with the Commission, they saw our results. The results were good, but the problem is one country wants an exception, then someone else wants an exception, and then suddenly you don't manage to achieve whatever you want to achieve. This is a difficult issue for Sweden. It's always difficult to be outside the norm. For example, we have a lot of forest, and in forestry policy, Sweden and Finland deviate from the other countries. And it takes a lot of effort, and there's a lot of focus on difficult negotiations. I believe that we have to, on one hand, we have to get more people to understand our model. It's important. We want to be assessed, but want to be assessed on the outcome and not on each particular rule. And we want to find a way forward. This is something which creates very serious challenges for us and a lot of effort. If a lot of energy, a lot of negative energy is used when it comes to sort of trying to find the problems in the directives. And now it's our chairman, Luther. We are looking at can we run for another 5 minutes or?
Can extend by a few minutes. Could we please check it with the interpreters? Okay. 5 minutes. Okay, that's actually great, but they are still. Thank you so much. Thank you so much into the booth. We are still having next two speakers or request for the floor. So I'm gonna be really very short, or if I could give the floor now to Marco and Zoe, who wanted to make still some contribution, and leave then, you know, something for myself at the end, if that would be so. If you could give them together, then give the panelists the chance to respond and, and then give me the floor. Thank you.
I give the word to Marco Wagner and then to Zoe. Just if you can make it short, we will be very happy. You will get extra dinner or something. So, Marco first.
Thank you very much, Sam. I'm here. I'll be very short. Je vais m'exprimer en français aussi. J'ai une question.
Hi, I'll be speaking French as well. I have a question that goes beyond the model of social relations in Sweden, but rather on the Scandinavian model of the welfare state. I've always heard that in Sweden and Denmark, everyone agrees to pay tax, sometimes very high taxes. And as an exchange, you can benefit from top-notch public services, often free of charge. So here's my question. This social cohesion, this consensus, this trust in one another in the state, does it still exist? Or are there still attacks against the welfare state as we can see in other parts of Europe and the world? Thank you.
Okay, so.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the panelists for those insightful contributions, also our group for organizing this session. I would also like, as I always do in Sweden, I feel compelled to thank Sweden, Swedish universities, the Swedish state, the trade unions, for providing a safe haven in the 60s and the 70s for the many, many hundreds of Greeks who escaped a military dictatorship and came here to find a safe haven of democracy, of rights, which explains why Sweden and the Swedish social model was a kind of inspiration for my generation. The second reason is that the Swedish social model impacted Greece in a very, strange perhaps way, because Andreas Papandreou, the visionary socialist, social democrat politician, he was one of the refugees who came and taught here. So when he came back to Greece after the fall of the junta in 1981, he won a landslide victory, and like in 1 year, he provided reforms. Most of them were made constitutional reforms that literally changed the social landscape of our country. Civil liberties, a model trade union law, and welfare state, and you had the political focus on legislation, which was very important. So we kind of owe all this to Sweden. So it's another reason for my generation. It was a source of inspiration. I'm very pleased to hear how resilient, the model is. In the case of Greece, of course, which is a different context, when we had the financial crisis and we had the IMF Troika dictate other kinds of reforms to Greece, some of the things we won were gone, but some of the things stayed. So I would like to ask our distinguished speakers, is there a concrete thing they feel has been taken away in Sweden from the Swedish social model? I mean, is it, one always hears, maybe, I don't know, it's the reactionary or conservative people who like to kind of, you have all those articles in The Economist, unwed mothers in Sweden suffer from the crisis. So in your opinion, is there a concrete thing you feel has regressed? And thank you very much again.
Who in the panel would like to answer or comment?
Okay.
Yeah.
Tusen tack.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions, which are slightly outside the scope of the Swedish social party's model, but I will try to answer briefly to the question of the general, the welfare state. If you ask the electorate about what the most important questions are, they would say healthcare, elderly care, and school. People still believe in a general welfare state. The authority in Sweden, which is mostly trusted by the Swedes, is the tax agency. we trust that we are taxed correctly. You don't fill out your tax returns. You basically put a check on your mobile phone and you send it away. You believe that what the tax agency does is correct. You believe that the taxes, or you trust rather that the taxes are done correctly, and you trust that your neighbors pay the taxes. This trust is still there. But this trust has to be defended all the time and reinforced all the time. When it comes to the question of what has recessed, what has gone away, I'd say that one thing, a major change of in the country, say in the past 20 years, it's the privatization of certain parts of the welfare system, which is financed by taxes. It's not just healthcare, elderly care, but school, but we also see that in the labor market policy, which creates different dynamics, different driving forces, and not necessarily provides the best welfare or provides the best labor market policy. So I don't know. I cannot say that this is something which has gone away, but this is a fundamental change of the Swedish society in the past 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. I mean, this discussion shows how important it is to deal with these issues, to be able to listen to each other, and just to do it. I mean, I've got here just 3 bullet points, where one would be to Iran, but I mean, we can discuss it next time, you know, whichever time. Actually, the Norway, as I got it correctly years ago, there is a non-written agreement about, among all the parties about the division of profit. That more or less 80% goes to the people and more or less 20% goes to the capital. That also is quite important game changer. So I don't know how is it here in Sweden, but we can definitely leave it for some other discussions. I was always going to ask about the Ukrainians, you know, which is the situation of them here, you know, how you manage after the big wave of migration in 2015, 2016. But I mean, that's probably not that important. What is important, and what is also from the previous discussion and from your contributions here important, is we all together need to work on building and strengthening international solidarity. Because, I mean, as you are describing it, and I've been talking about it and going to the literature, talking about it with a number of people, is the Swedish model, and you are proving is working very well, adapting itself and so on. But if I would love to be provocative, then I would like to ask you, what shall I say to a worker in my union, working for a Swedish multinational, fighting hard for getting a minimum wage in my country, which is X times lower, of course, than the minimum wage here in Sweden, and is nicely below the living wage, and some of these people need to go to the state and ask for some benefits to be on the living minimum. So, I mean, this is the huge issue we need to be working together with. And of course, you know, a lot of the aspects and features and elements of your system could be a very good inspiration, but I would rather say we should do it on the European level, because we've got very well-functioning internal market. Unfortunately, with these social issues, we are not on that level, which for me is the biggest obstacle for real competitiveness of the EU as such. We cannot be just building on competitiveness in certain regions or states or professions. We just need to do it together, as I guess it has been you, Veronica, pointing out rightly. We need to focus on the weakest link. And the weakest link, for my understanding for the moment, is living standards and wages across the EU. But definitely, thank you very much for giving the details of the model, showing us, you know, how you are also fighting and really working hard on improving the conditions for your members, in a sense, for all of us on the European level, although rather indirectly, I would say. And I'm sure we're going to be continuing in this discussion, and because the mutual understanding is the best way how to move the things further. So thank all the panelists for the moment. Thank you so much. A piece of housekeeping issue. Some of you have been asking the organizers where the dinner tonight is. Firstly, you have received it in an email April 19th with all the other practical information, but here is the name of the restaurant and the address. There is no organized transport there, so please be there 7:30, because firstly we are in Sweden and people are punctual here, which is perfect. And you know me, I love people to be, on time. So thanks a lot for your discussion, your commitment to today's debate. See you 7:30 in the restaurant, and see you tomorrow morning here back at 9 o'clock, please. Thank you, and thanks a lot to the interpreters for the great flexibility.